Tonight we have a really special guest. Actually, we have three very special guests. The first two of which I'm going to introduce our two student moderators, Clara Cootie and Amelia Harley, who will be at the end of our esteemed guest's conversation, will lead the conversation to Dr. Lapchick about, race and bias in sports. But I want to introduce Claire and Amelia to the conversation, and we'll start with Claire. Claire, introduce yourself, and Amelia, you are to follow, and then we will introduce our esteemed guest.
Hi, everyone. I'm Clara Cootie. I'm a sophomore at East Rockaway High School. I'm so excited to be talking with you guys today. This is a very important conversation. I'm so glad I could be a part of it. I play varsity badminton and I was on the JV volleyball team. I am so excited to moderate this event. I can't state that enough. Thank you so much, Dr. Lapchick, for coming and speaking with us. You're a huge inspiration, and I'm so excited that I can even moderate this conversation and interview you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to join us with Dr. Lapchick tonight. My name is Amelia Harley, and I'm a junior at Manhasset High School on Long Island. I've been running varsity cross country, winter track, and spring track and field since I was a freshman, and we are very excited to be a part of tonight's event because conversations about racism and social injustices are louder than they've ever been. Our country stands at a critical turning point in its history, and it's up to us to make the change and push for a better future. Luckily, we have Team Up for Unity, which provides us a platform for us to play our part. Strength comes in numbers, and together we can make a difference. Thank you, Dr. Lapchick, for joining us tonight.
So without further ado, here's a brief overview, and a little bit of a bio of our esteemed guest tonight, Dr. Richard Lapchick.
Richard grew up in a family where there was a strong tradition of doing the right thing. His father was an iconic figure. He signed Sweetwater Clifton to the Knicks, breaking the color barrier.
His recollections alone of being around his father growing up would fill a dinner table conversation with great tales of meeting Jackie Robinson when he was a kid, seeing what his father went through for fielding the first black player in Knick history.
Joe was someone who, as a coach, never let race get in the way of doing the right thing. And there's no question that that had a huge impact on Richard himself.
When I was 14, I was at a basketball camp with 5 other white guys. One of the white guys was hurling the N-word at the black guy day in and day out till I challenged him, and this guy knocked me out cold. Well, the black guy was Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, then Lou Alcindor, and a lifelong friendship grew out of that.
Everything Richard has fought for has not been popular at the time. And he has been this courageous light that has said, this needs to be said, this needs to be heard, and I'm gonna say it.
There's a fine line sometimes between being courageous and putting your life on the line. With progress comes pain. And that was a price that he was willing to pay.
When I was the American leader of the sports boycott of South Africa, I was actually attacked in my office in a college library by 2 masked men and had the N-word carved in my stomach.
Richard had very bravely spoken out against apartheid. There were risks involved. There were just a lot of bigots who didn't like what he had to say.
He was attacked for standing up and wanting to right a wrong. And to be brutally attacked as he was, to have the N-word carved with scissors into his stomach, he had to have been frightened beyond words. And a lesser person would have said, okay, that's it, I'm done. Not Rich. They who did that, it's the wrong person.
I've been involved in civil rights for the last 28 years of my life, but I can never, ever, ever know what it's like to be black. That's an instantaneous, every minute sentence that society has given to Black communities and Hispanic communities in this country, that discrimination can take place at any time.
My dad taught me that a leader is somebody who stands up for justice and doesn't block its path. I've spent most of my adult life trying to help young people who live in crises that have become more profound as the generations have gone on.
You know, he's really been in the forefront in the whole bridge between sports and using that to achieve equality, not only here in the United States, but around the world.
He's been involved in civil rights and race issues for his entire life.
I automatically smile when I think of Richard. Wow. I smile and also a tear comes to my eyes. Whew. He's a good man. I thank him. I'm appreciative of the work that he has done. Thank you. Thank you, Richard Lapchick. Thank you for being you, and thank you for wanting this world to be a better place, and because of you, it is.
And without further ado, there is a very, very long bio of Dr. Richard Lapchick on any and all websites, most importantly at the University of Central Florida, where Dr. Lapchick is an eminent scholar, endowed chair and director of the DeVos Sports Business Management. He's vice president, CEO of ISSJ, director of the Institute for Diversity and Ethics in Sports, and has won more awards than we could possibly itemize here. He is a role model for all of us that have worked in sports for a long period of time. And I worked for a very good friend of Dr. Lapchick's when I was in Sacramento. And he came to Sacramento to talk to us about diversity in sports and racism. And I learned, and that was 20 something odd years ago. Randomly, I crossed my fingers and hoped he would do this for us at Team Up for Unity. And without further ado, a man who's listed on Who's Who in America. He's got lifetime awards. He's got 9 honorary degrees. He is board member of so many different organizations. I welcome Dr. Richard Lapchick. Thank you for joining us. And thank you for doing this for the youngsters and the parents and the teachers and the educators and administrators of sports on Long Island. Welcome, Dr. Richard Lapchick.
Thank you very much for the kind words. Claire and Amelia, it's a pleasure to meet you both. I look forward to talking to you a little bit later on. And I'm grateful to the Long Island Nets, as well as the Nets gaming crew, for hosting me here this afternoon. I think the mission you've undertaken to address, to take anti-racism stands, especially with students at the high school level who are going to make such a difference with their generation, is an incredible mission. And the Team Up for Unity theme is something that's close to my heart. So I hope I can say something worthwhile for everybody. Obviously, we're all involved in the world of sport. It's a new world of sport in the last 16 months. Between the pandemic and the racial reckoning, sports will never be the same. I am proud of the role that sports has played during this period of time. When an NBA player tested positively in March of last year, America had not begun to shut down at all, although many people felt that they should have because of the pandemic. Within hours, Adam Silver shut down the NBA. Within 2 days, all of sports was completely shut down. It's estimated that if the rest of America was shut down by that point, another 50,000 lives probably would have been saved. I was proud of the big-heartedness of sport. A 19-year-old rookie who had never played a game announced the day after the shutdown that he was donating $1 million to support the workers in New Orleans. It's Zion Williamson with the New Orleans Pelicans, that those workers wouldn't have games to work at. So Zion put up $1 million. In the next 6 weeks, players, coaches, teams, and leagues put up over $150 million at a time that the economy was reeling to support anti-COVID relief efforts. There was a vacuum in the world of sports. We couldn't see sports. I found myself watching Korean baseball games on ESPN just to fill the void, but then suddenly the void didn't matter with the murder of George Floyd. a racial reckoning began, such as I think we have not seen in my lifetime. I'm 75, and the issue of police brutality became a central part of the discussion. So many people in 2019, the year before the murder of George Floyd, there were only 27 days in the entire year that a police officer did not shoot and kill a citizen of his or her community. 54% of the people who were shot in 2019 were people of color. Now, obviously, some of those cases were in the line of duty, but too many were instances like George Floyd. The discussion of police brutality opened up a discussion of racial equity in general. So we had to talk about housing and education and healthcare. We have to talk about criminal justice. We have to talk about the financial industry, which has excluded communities of color from many of the resources that they need to emerge from the tremendous gap between the wealth of white people and people of color. I'm going to talk about facing uncomfortable truths here this afternoon. Clearly, the George Floyd murder had us talking about instances of racism in 2021 and 2020 that can be drawn right back to the beginning of slavery in 1619 in the United States. The Me Too movement several years ago forced us to face how sexist and misogynistic we are as a country. The renaming of the Washington football team forced us to remember that America was actually started with the eradication of its indigenous people. The Pulse nightclub shooting. I live in Orlando. I'm on the board of the One Pulse Foundation. 49 angels lost their life that day, nearly 5 years ago. And we had to confront how homophobic we are in the United States. And we also confront the increasing acts of anti-Semitism in the United States, and how anti-Semitism has always been part of when we talk about hate in this country. We are a violent country. We sometimes read about violence in Chicago or someplace else, where a group of teenagers might have been killed over the weekend on any given day in the United States. An average of 12 children under the age of 16 die of a handgun. We are a violent society. So I'm going to share a little bit more about myself. Some of it you saw in the video. I was 5 years old when I looked outside my bedroom window in Yonkers, New York, where I was raised, and saw my father's image swing from a tree with people under the tree picketing. For several years after that, I'd pick up the extension phone in our house, my dad not knowing I was listening, and it was racial epithet after racial epithet being hurled at him. I had no idea as a 5, 6, and 7-year-old what that meant. All I knew is that there were a lot of people in this country who disliked my best friend. And I would later find out, as you saw in the video, that my dad signed the first Black player in the history of the NBA, Nat Sweetwater Clifton, about a week before the NBA draft, resulted in 2 other Black players starting the season in 1950. A league that's now 80% African-American. In 1950, there were a lot of people who did not want to see that happen. So my dad is a double inductee into the Basketball Hall of Fame. He played for the original Celtics. He coached St. John's University, not too far from where you are, for 20 years, and then Knicks for 10 years. And everybody assumed that I was going to follow in his footsteps. He was the first great big man in the game. He was 6'5" from 15 to 36 when he played. I was 6 feet tall in the 8th grade, one of the tallest players in New York City, and was recruited pretty heavily by a lot of schools, including Power Memorial High School. Power was the top basketball program in the country, along with DeMatha in Washington, D.C. I chose not to go there, but became friends with the coach. That's how I ended up in the camp that you saw in the video, and began the friendship with Lou Alcindor then, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar now. The friendship is so important in my life that when Kareem received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Barack Obama in the last month of his administration, I was one of his 2 guests, along with Henry Louis Gates. He asked me to speak at the Staples Center when his statue was finally unveiled, and Kareem flew here to be with me when I was scheduled to have surgery 5 years ago, here being in Orlando, crossing the country to be with me. But what was important, when I was a 15-year-old white kid from an almost all white community in Yonkers, I suddenly had a young urban African-American lens through which I could see what racism was doing in Kareem's community and other communities of color. And I decided as a 15-year-old that I was going to spend the rest of my life working in the area of civil rights. I didn't know what that meant as a 15-year-old, but I knew that's what I wanted to do. I ended up getting a PhD in international race relations. It was the first such PhD in the country. And I did my dissertation on how South Africa used sport as part of its foreign policy and the international response and protests to it, and compared it to how the Nazis had done that in the 1930s. I started teaching in Virginia in 1970, and the dissertation was published as a book in 1974. I started speaking about apartheid and eventually founded the Sports Boycott of South Africa. South Africa, if you don't know, was the most racist system of government on the face of the earth in the second half of the 20th century. If you were a person of color, and 81% of the people in South Africa were, you couldn't own land, you couldn't vote, you couldn't send your children to the schools you wanted to, you were there to serve a powerful and wealthy white economy. It's the only time in peacetime that the world's governments came together to try to strangle a regime to bring it to its knees. There was a trade boycott, an oil boycott, a bank loan boycott, and a sports boycott. South Africa could smuggle in currency, could smuggle in oil, could smuggle in trade, but they couldn't play sports in the dark. So it became South Africa's Achilles heel. The first South African team to come to the United States, as you heard in the video, was a Davis Cup team playing in the North American zone of the Davis Cup, because the European countries would no longer compete against South Africa. So my role as the head of the coalition that was organized to stop the matches was to go to Nashville where the matches were going to be played. I was working closely with the African governments. They asked me to announce that they would boycott the 1984 Los Angeles Olympic Games if this team was allowed to come. I held a press conference to announce that before the speech at Vanderbilt. Dick Schaap, who was Jeremy's dad, was covering for NBC Nightly News and came up to me and said that the financial backers of the Davis Cup had pulled out. It looked like the matches were going to be canceled. I announced that to the crowd. It was an anti-apartheid crowd. They went crazy. And when I flew home to Virginia that night, I felt maybe for the first time in my life, I'd done something worthwhile. The next night was the night you heard about in the video. I was working late in my college office. The school library it was in the school's library, which closed. And there was a knock on the door. I assumed it was the campus security. But when I opened the door, it was in fact two men wearing stocking masks who proceeded to cause liver damage, kidney damage, a concussion, and carved, as you saw, the N-word in my stomach with a pair of office scissors. Alton, that night in the hospital bed where I was, I realized that I wanted to spend the rest of my life using this sports platform to address racism and other forms of social injustice. I felt that if people had gone to the length they did to try to stop my father 28 years before, and to the length they did to try to stop me that night, that they must have thought that using the sports platform was an effective way to fight against racism. So as you can hear, my journey on the issue of race in sport has been personal and profound. But as the years went on, I began to work also on other issues. I had important women in my life who influenced me. My sister was a civil rights activist in the 1950s before it was even called the Civil Rights Movement. She moved to Africa in 1961, and I began to read about Africa and fell in love with the continent. I am madly in love, married for the last 35 years. My wife is an ardent feminist, as is our 31-year-old daughter. And they point out any social injustice that they see in terms of women very quickly for me if they think I've missed it. So in the 2016 and the last presidential campaign, there was a lot of discussion about women earning 78 cents on the dollar compared to a white man in the same job. They didn't usually say that if you were a Black woman, the average was 64 cents on the dollar. If you were Latina, the average was 53 cents on the dollar. Women make up 51% of the American population, but they only make up 19% of the people sitting in the House of Representatives and 22% of the seats in the Senate. We rank 100th globally for the percentage of women holding national office, 100th globally, behind countries like Afghanistan, Iraq, and Pakistan, not necessarily known as feminist strongholds. Maybe that's why the United States is one of only 4 countries on the planet that does not, and the others being Swaziland, Lesotho, and Papua New Guinea, that does not have mandated paid maternity leave. We rank 46th in the world in maternal mortality rates, 46th, behind Saudi Arabia, Libya, Kuwait, and Kazakhstan. Only 4% of Fortune 500 companies are led by women. But when you look at the story globally, it gets even worse. One of the most influential books I read in my lifetime was called Half the Sky by Nicholas Kristof and Cheryl Woodun. Kristof is a New York Times columnist. It's about the oppression of women globally and the heroic resistance of those women. But the two statistics that I'm going to share with you that stick in my throat as I share them are these: that more women and girls died simply because they were a woman or a girl in the 20th century than all of the soldiers who died in all of the wars of the 20th century combined. And that more women and girls were murdered simply because they were a woman or a girl in acts of gendercide than all of the people who died in acts of genocide in the 20th century combined. Every morning I wake up and I think of the 32 million girls worldwide who are school-age girls who won't go to school that day because it's against the custom or the laws of their country for a girl to get an education. It's why this then young girl, now young woman, Wonder Woman, Malala, won the Nobel Peace Prize at age 19 because she literally risked her life so girls in her village could get an education. Women and girls between the ages of 15 and 44 globally are more likely to die or be maimed by male violence than by cancer, malaria, war, and traffic accidents combined. 100,000 girls are sold as under the age of 12 are sold as child brides overseas. Millions of girls and women are sold into human trafficking, many into the sex trade. Former President Jimmy Carter called the oppression of women and girls the worst human rights abuse on the planet. In his book, A Call to Action, I don't know if it's the worst, but it's certainly up there. But there are so many social justice issues that we're talking about here with your group and that we're talking about in the country. So America's children, put quite simply, have learned how to hate. It's when Barack Obama became president, there were 625 hate groups in the United States. When he left office, there were 950 hate groups. When Donald Trump left office, there were 1,200 hate groups in the United States. Hate acts are happening significantly more frequently today than at any other time in our history. Our children are also waging war on one another. I mentioned that 12 children under the age of 16 die of a handgun wound every day. 400,000 high school students, according to the Center for Disease Control, are hospitalized every year because of a violent incident that takes place on high school property during high school hours. The urban dropout rate is 40% in the United States. 4.3 million American women are battered every year. 900,000 are raped every year. 34% of teenage girls will have a child before they reach the age of 20. And when researchers ask them, why did you risk by having this child finishing your education or having the career you might have desired? Only 1% will ever go to college. 3% will finish high school. The almost universal response of those girls was, because I wanted somebody to love me, because they didn't feel loved at that moment. We're the biggest consumers of drugs in the world. The biggest consumers of drugs in the United States are people under the age of 25. Why do you take a drug? Presumably you think you feel better with it than you feel without it. We're the biggest consumers of performance-enhancing drugs in the United States are not NFL players, Major League Baseball players, or track and field athletes. They're teenage boys who aren't athletes at all, who take the substance to feel stronger or faster, or whatever it is they're trying to change about the body that they were given at birth. The reports of child abuse in the United States are made every 10 seconds. There's a report of child abuse, and 1 in 10 is actually reported. You can do the math to see how extensive a problem this is. I could talk at great length about the issue of human trafficking, but I'll leave it at this particular point by saying that as a student of international race relations, I studied the Atlantic slave trade and knew that over the 240 years of the Atlantic slave trade, 10 million Africans were enslaved in the Americas, 8 million were enslaved in Africa, 6 million were enslaved in Asia, another 10 million died in the slave trade, but 24 million Africans were enslaved during the 240-year history of the Atlantic slave trade. Perhaps along with the Holocaust, the two most horrific incidents of human misbehavior and horror ever perpetrated on the human race. But today it's estimated that between 28 and 32 million human slaves exist around the globe. And if we think it's a problem of other countries, we need to understand that there are close to 1 million people who are human trafficked in the United States. More than half are girls and women. If you are a girl and brought into the slave trade, the average age is age 12, you will be in the sex trade. Sports is a big business. We know that. $62.5 billion generated by the 67 top professional sports leagues globally, a lot of money. human trafficking nets $150 billion a year, 2.5 times the revenue generated by all the sports combined. But the thing I want to share with you most emphatically is the wealth gap in the United States, because it's the root cause of everything else that we're talking about during the racial reckoning and in any anti-racism efforts. The Forbes list of the 400 wealthiest Americans, have an aggregate wealth greater than all 42 million African Americans combined. I want to say that again because it's so almost impossible to believe. The aggregate wealth of the 400 wealthiest Americans have more money aggregately than all 42 million African Americans combined. Again, I think it's the root of everything else that we're talking about in this country, and creates that wealth gap is at the heart of healthcare, education, housing, the financial industry, the criminal justice system. We represent 5% of the world's population. We have 25% of the world's prison population. They're mostly brown and black. They've mostly committed crimes that won't even be on the books in a few years, as drug offenses are taken off the books of most legislatures around the country. Some people say to me, well, when they get out of prison, they'll be able to have a normal life. That's not the way it works in America. You don't have any federal rights. You can't get food stamps. You can't vote. And if you go for a job and the employer says to you, have you ever been convicted of a felony? And the answer is yes, that's usually going to be the end of the discussion. So I will have spoken to you approximately 30 minutes here this afternoon. If it was a typical 30 minutes in the United States, this is what would have happened in this 30 minutes. 70 children dropped out of school. 23 high school students were victimized by violence. It's likely that a child under the age of 16 was killed by a handgun. 42 children were reported missing. 23 babies were born to teenage mothers. 1,800 children were abused. 258 women or girls were battered. 52 were raped. 58 were enslaved. During the 30 minutes that I'm speaking to you this afternoon, I don't have any doubt that if there were more women and people of color running our government, running our corporations, running our institutions of higher education, running faith-based America, that we'd be addressing these issues, which we are rarely talking about in the federal government. We would be able to build a roof over the dreams of children who don't believe that they can accomplish certain things in life, and to build a floor on the despair that way too many live in. So how do I feel about America today? Alton asked me to address that. Can we face these uncomfortable truths and really have everyone being equal? So in 1977, I was in Lusaka in Zambia with my mentor. My mentor's name was George Hauser. If he was alive today, he would be 104. He died 4 years ago at age 100. But in 1944, he rode on the first Freedom Ride. He founded the Congress of Racial Equality in 1984. He spent 2 years in prison as a conscientious objector. He founded the anti-apartheid and the anti-colonial movements in the United States. When I read about George Hauser, who happened to be a white guy, it gave me hope that as a white person, I might be able to have an impact in anti-racist efforts in the United States and globally. So I was with George in 1977, and I said, George, do you think we'll ever live to see the day when South Africa will be free and Namibia and Zimbabwe, 2 countries that were dominated by apartheid in Southern Africa? This was 12 years before Mandela was released. There weren't even rumors that he would be released. The rumors were that he would die in prison of tuberculosis. Apartheid was at its highest point in terms of strangling Black people in those 3 countries. There was no reason to hope that George Hauser and I would live to see the day that it would end. But George said to me, Rich, I feel it in my gut that we will live to see that day. And on May 10th of 1994, in one of the proudest moments of my life, George Hauser and I stood on the steps of the Union buildings in Pretoria in South Africa as Nelson Mandela's guests as he became president of South Africa. And it tells me that all the things I just talked about are things that we can overcome. If Nelson Mandela, who was the most hated person by the white government in South Africa for all those years, political prisoner for 27 years, could become the president of that country, then anything and everything is possible. And that fuels my feeling that the racial reckoning can be sustained today in ways that it hasn't been before. I feel it in my gut. There's no history here telling me that, but I feel it in my gut. I feel that your generation, Amelia and Claire, the millennials, as well have a bigger social conscience than previous generations, that you're more committed to social justice issues than my generation was. You have the technology to bring about change. We all watched so many times George Floyd die over and over again because somebody captured it with their smartphone. We have that technology now, so the police can't argue that it happened this way when we can clearly see how it actually happened. The social media that you work with communicates these things so rapidly. I'm told by the Black leaders that I work with, as well as Black friends, that they feel for the first time that white people are actually listening to what racism is doing to those people as individuals, as well as the Black and brown communities in America and Asian communities as well. 26 million people marched in the streets in the last year, the biggest mass movement in the history of the United States. And for the first time, there were large numbers of white people in those protests as well. And we're all here talking about sports. The other thing that gives me the most hope is athlete activism. It's been unleashed in ways that I haven't seen in my lifetime, that I've worked to have happen in my lifetime. But previously, when an athlete stood up for social justice, their careers pretty much ended. When John Carlos and Tommy Smith stood on the victory podium in Mexico City and raised their black clenched fists, they didn't get a job in the United States for 7 years. Muhammad Ali, when he refused to go to Vietnam at the end of the 1960s, faced 5 years in prison. And athletes who stood up in the intervening decades all paid a price, including Colin Kaepernick, who just 40 years ago ended his football career because of what he was willing to do and the stand he was willing to take. Now, when the Milwaukee Bucks walked off the court in the bubble during the NBA playoffs because of a shooting that had taken place in Kenosha, Wisconsin, within an hour, the entire league and its players association decided to shut down, and every other sport shut down as well. Athlete activism is here. It's going to be critically important as we go ahead. I say to you, in the work that you're doing in the anti-racism efforts that your organization is supporting for high school students in particular, that everybody can't be on the front lines, but everybody's got to get off the sidelines. What can you do? First of all, you got to listen and learn. Listen to people talk about racism, read about racism. There are so many great books about it. Take the responsibility for educating yourself. Raise your voices as you're doing with this movement that you've started here. You can raise it in different ways. If you're capable and feel comfortable demonstrating, by all means, get out in the streets. If you don't feel comfortable, you can volunteer for organizations that are working on the issues that are of greatest concern to you, and have your efforts sustain their efforts. You can, if you're in a position to do so. I can tell you, as somebody who's worked in anti-racist organizations, created anti-racist organizations over the last 50 years, that other than putting our bodies on the line, the hardest thing to do is to raise money to fight against racism. So if you or your parents or people you know are capable, then I urge you in the strongest way to possibly donate to those organizations. We saw that America rallied for the vote in November, rallied for the vote in Georgia in January, and now we see that 32 states have legislation before them. Florida, where I live, actually having passed it, that is engaged in voter suppression. Organize against that and fight against that voter suppression so we can have free and fair elections. A lot of people ask me, with all the social injustice things that you talk about, why do you stay in the world of sport? For me, the answer is simple. We have the miracle of sport in the huddle. It's the only place I can think of where when you step into that huddle, it does not matter if you're white or black or African-American or Latino or Asian American or Arab American, doesn't matter if you're Protestant, Catholic, Buddhist, Sikh, Jew, Hindu, or Muslim, young or old, gay or straight, come from a rich family or a poor family. If you don't work together, once you break that huddle, your team's not going to win. Imagine if we took the huddle into the corporate offices of our teams, of our leagues, of our institutions of higher education, of your high schools, of corporate America and faith-based America, what a different world it would be. I want to close my comments by saying that when I first started out in this work in the late 1960s, I went through a training session, and the facilitator to do an icebreaker to start us off said, I'd like everybody to write down what they'd like to be on their tombstone. So I literally wrote almost all the categories I'm going to share with you right now. But I've added a couple in the interim years, but this is what I wrote. He didn't have to be Jewish to want to fight against anti-Semitism. He didn't have to be a person of color to want to fight against racism. He didn't have to be a woman to want to fight against sexism. He didn't have to be from the LGBTQ community to want to fight against homophobia. He didn't have to be Muslim to want to fight against Islamophobia. He didn't have to have a physical or mental disability to want to fight for people who do have such disabilities. He didn't have to be poor to want to fight against poverty. He didn't have to be an immigrant or a refugee to fight against xenophobia. He understood that we're all cut from the same human fabric. If as leaders, those of you who are in high school, those of you who are working in the organizations that are supporting this movement in Long Island, stand up for justice and don't block its path. If our children have learned how to hate, we can teach them how to love again. If they're waging war on one another, we have the tools to give them to help them make peace. Thank you so much for listening this afternoon. I look forward to the discussion with Claire and Amelia at this point, and thank you so much for listening.
Dr. Lapchick, I'm floored, but why would we have any other expectation? Thank you for that. And Claire and Amelia, over to you. If you two could start with your second question, that would be fabulous. I will turn it now over to our moderators, Clara Cootie, Amelia Harley, you're on.
Thank you so much. The facts and statistics you gave are truly frightening and also eye-opening, which is extremely important. I know you touched on this a little bit with your origin story, but you've made great strides in sports business leadership. We were wondering if there was a certain aha moment that really helped you get into this world of activism and leadership in anti-racism movements. We weren't sure if this was something that you knew you would always wanted to do. You kind of touched on that, but if you could give us a specific moment that really inspired you, that would be amazing.
Well, I was raised, as you heard, in a family that issues of civil rights were important to. When my dad played for the original Celtics, there were no integrated teams. Black teams didn't play against white teams, and his team, the original Celtics, became the first white team to play against black teams. And my dad began to see the effects of racism, and I think he carried that through in his career as a coach, both at St. John's and then with the Knicks by signing the first black player. The aha moment for me, because that was over learning from my father, was really over a period of time. And I was too young to really get it in the beginning. But that moment with Kareem and the friendship that was developed, that was the aha moment for me. And the most inspirational moment for me, I think, was being there on the steps of the Union buildings in South Africa, watching Nelson Mandela be inaugurated. After the inauguration, there were parties being held all over Pretoria for Nelson Mandela, and he chose not to go to any of them. He got in a helicopter and went back to Johannesburg and went to a Zambia-South Africa soccer match. And he asked me to sit in the box with him. And I said, Mr. President, because he now was Mr. President, why did you choose to come here instead of all those parties? And he said, Richard, and I was pretty sure I knew what the answer was, Claire, but I wanted to hear him say it so I could share it with you. And he said, Richard, I wanted my people to know that I know that I was released from prison sooner than I would have been, and I became president sooner than I would have been because of the sacrifices our athletes made during the sports boycott. And we were sitting in the box in the stadium where the World Rugby Cup was going to take place the next year. And I don't have any doubt that Nelson Mandela was plotting how he was going to use that World Rugby Cup to bring his people together. And some of you may have seen the movie Invictus. That's what it was about. It was an incredible moment, again, using the power of sport to bring people together who had been divided for so long. But great question, Claire.
Thank you. I'm going to just ask a little bit of a follow-up question. When you finally got into this world of activism, especially using sports, was it what you thought it would be? Was it more than you thought it would be? Were there eye-opening experiences? I'm sure there was, but do you have an example?
Well, I was lucky enough to become friends with Carlos and Smith. You'll see maybe over my shoulder a picture of me with Muhammad Ali and Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the United Nations. I worked for the United Nations. They rescued me out of Virginia at the time after the attack. And I was able to bring Ali to come speak at the General Assembly about racism, and the friendship kind of began there. That was really important for me, and to see his courage and his willingness to stand up for justice for so many years, in spite of incredible hardships that he went through for doing that, inspired me to want to keep doing what I was doing.
So now we wanted to move on to the next question, and we wanted to thank you for all of your incredible contributions in fighting all of the isms, as I like to call them, that society is plagued with today. And so we wanted to dive into some of your more specific accomplishments. So for those of you who are unaware, as it was mentioned in the video, Dr. Lapchick is the director of the DeVos Business Management Program of the University of Central Florida, which is a program that has been named one of the nation's top 5 programs by the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Forbes, and ESPN, the magazine. It is also one of the top two graduate sport business programs in the world. So we wanted to know if you could talk a little bit more about what your experience has been like as the director of this program.
Well, we've attracted amazing students. They come to us as opposed to the other graduate programs in the country, because we're the only one that not only gives them the business skills to get an MBA as well as a master's in sports business management, but we also teach them and imbue in everything we do that sports is a powerful tool, and they can use it to bring about positive social change. Our students work 21 hours a semester volunteering for Central Florida not sports agencies, but agencies that serve underserved youth. The number 21 probably sounds pretty random, but if you multiply it by 2, it's 42, which is Jackie Robinson's number, and that's why we chose that. We start the year every year in August before anybody ever sets foot in a classroom. It's a 2-year program, bringing all of our students, the new students and the returning students, to New Orleans, where we've been rebuilding homes since 2006 after Hurricane Katrina. We worked on more than 158 homes in the lower 9th Ward, where most of the Black population of New Orleans lived. And it's been just an incredible experience to work shoulder to shoulder. They see me, with paint in my hair and mud on my face, and they see my wife and our family working with them shoulder to shoulder. And it creates a different atmosphere than that first day of class. We're not meeting people for the first time. We're actually brothers and sisters who have worked, sweated together for some meaningful social justice issues. So, and we also, the average student body of a typical sports management graduate program is 6% students of color, 20% women, 20% former student athletes. Ours has been 40% students of color, 60% women, 60% former student athletes. So as leagues and teams and colleges try to actually diversify their staffs, we're the biggest talent pool that exists out there for those diverse populations.
So clearly community and service are really essential components of this program, and it's obviously very successful because it attracts a very diverse population. And we were also kind of wondering, what kind of opportunities do you have post-DeVos in the, I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, in the realm of human rights activism?
Well, again, when they leave us, they are going to whatever organization they're going to. Usually, we have a lot of former students who work for teams, for leagues, for college athletic departments, for agencies that deal in the world of sports. But they go with that kind of mission in their hearts that if they see an opportunity, that they can seize on that opportunity. So after the Pulse nightclub shooting, again, which took place here, it took place on a Saturday night. It happened that the Tampa Bay Rays, which if you have known anything about them, are the least attended, they have the smallest fan base of any team in the history of modern professional sport. They average 6,000 fans a game. They hadn't taken the tarps off the second deck since 2006, but they dedicated that game to the victims, the survivors, and the frontline workers of the Pulse nightclub shooting. And they had them on the field in a 1-hour ceremony before the game. They sold all 42,000 tickets. Said they could have sold 100,000 tickets because people wanted to be together to feel that they were doing something about the Pulse nightclub shooting. The next night, the Orlando City soccer team had its regularly scheduled game. 37,000 people were going. The fans organized themselves so that when we walked into the stadium, and they were also doing an hour dedicated to the Pulse nightclub shooting in the same groups that I mentioned before. The entire stadium was every section had a different color shirt on because the fans had organized on Facebook that they would wear, whatever the color was. So the entire stadium looked like a rainbow flag. And both of those events were organized by our graduates who were working in those two organizations. So they knew that they could do something and went for it. So they're ready, they're poised. We had students working for the New Orleans Saints after Hurricane Katrina, and they helped mobilize the rebuilding efforts and getting the Saints out into the community. And so things like that.
That's incredible. It's like the values you teach them there, they carry with them for life, and it becomes their life mission.
We hope so, and we think so. And it's during this particular period of time since George Floyd's murder, I've had so many of the students, call me and send me notes about how much they realized that they got that other people didn't get, based on diversity being, a founding principle of our program. Nobody else was emphasizing that. Now, if you look at anybody's website, it says diversity is, a pillar of the program, but that's all new to most of the schools. I'm glad they're doing it, but they're late to the game.
Yeah, we've definitely been seeing that recently. I'm going to pass it on to Claire for the next question.
Okay, thanks, Amelia.
Thank you. Students are very impressionable, and I'm so glad that your team and your school are able to help kids learn about diversity and become better people. Upon reading your biography, we found your work in using sports as a way to draw awareness to the injustices of apartheid truly inspiring. We were wondering if you could share a specific experience that took place in Africa where you saw the power of sports as a great unifier.
Well, I think in post-apartheid South Africa, then President Mandela used the sports events to bring people together. They also had this World Soccer Cup in 2010, and it was an amazing event at bringing people together. The NBA, I brought the NBA to South Africa for the first time. President Mandela, well, he's then Nelson Mandela, he wasn't president yet, asked us to bring a program that we started in America called Project Teamwork that used the concept of teamwork to bring people of different racial groups together and to teach conflict resolution skills. And I asked David Stern, the head of the NBA players, the head of the NBA and the head of the Players Association, Charlie Grantham, to come, and they brought Patrick Ewing, Dikembe Mutombo, and Alonzo Mourning with the players. With Nelson Mandela, where when he hosted the NBA for a dinner in South Africa. I don't know if you noticed, but there was a little baby when we were saying hello to greeting Nelson Mandela. That was my daughter, whose greatest regret in life as a 31 was she slept through the entire evening with Nelson Mandela.
That's amazing. I am envious of your daughter, definitely. Just a quick question. You were one of the 200 people invited to Nelson Mandela's inauguration in May of 1994. Would you consider Nelson Mandela's work an inspiration of your own?
Well, there's no question that Nelson Mandela, first of all, I think one of the reasons he became so beloved is he comes out of 27 years in basically solitary confinement in prison. For the most part, solitary confinement in horrible conditions. And I think everybody around the globe would have understood and probably expected him to come out hating white people, but instead he came out embracing everybody and truly wanting to unify the country. And I think that's why the global community fell in love with him across all different racial groups. So his inspiration as a role model, just set a stage for people who would follow him. I happened to come in contact when I first started this work in the sports area. It was at Northeastern University in Boston. And I had read about a young man named Darrell Williams, who was a high school sophomore at Jamaica Plain High School in the height of busing in Boston, which was one of the most violent periods in the places in the country. And Darrell's dream was to play high school football. And Darrell came out, was playing for Jamaica Plain High School against Charlestown, which was an all-white school, in a racially charged match. And he scored a touchdown in the first half. His dream was to play for the Patriots. He didn't have any feelings about race at all. And during the halftime, thinking that my dream has started, I scored a touchdown. 3 white teenagers on the top of an apartment building gunned him down. And he became a quadriplegic ever since. He was in the hospital for almost 2 years. And when he came out, a lot of people assumed he was going to come out hating white people, but he came out, and this is what Darrell Williams communicated. White people didn't shoot me. 3 white people shot me. And it helped heal the Boston community. And I kind of called Darrell America's unknown Nelson Mandela, because he had that in his heart, the same as Mandela had in his heart.
That is so inspiring. You've done and continue to do so much in the sports, business, and inclusion domains of society. What inspires you to continue doing what you're doing? What encourages you to wake up and make a change every day?
Well, first of all, I'm madly in love with a social justice advocate, and we do a lot of it shoulder to shoulder. I think if she wasn't, with me and supporting me, and me, her, it would have been a little harder, but she is. But knowing that there's a possibility for change, having seen some fundamental changes, feeling right now that in this period of time since the murder of George Floyd, as I said a little bit earlier in the presentation, it's a unique moment because of the various factors, including your generation's passion, that gives me that hope that we can bring about change. And, as somebody, my dad taught me that if a leader is somebody who stands up for justice and doesn't block its path. There's a lot of great definitions of leadership in a business sense, but for me, that's what a leader is, somebody who stands up for justice and doesn't block its path. So when I wake up in the morning, I'm ready to stand up.
I think everyone here today is looking to become a leader as well. I'm gonna hand it over to Amelia.
So we wanted to obviously reflect on the fact that you have received countless awards, honors, and initiated so much positive change in the world that one can only hope to achieve in their lifetime. As Claire said, we can only hope to become half as great a leader as you have been. And so you launched the DeVos program, you formed the Hope for Stanley Alliance, the Center for the Study of Sport and Society at Northeastern, Teamwork South Africa, and so many more initiatives geared towards eradicating racism and by using the power of sports and business. So we were wondering if you had any advice for students who hope to make the same changes as you and who would eventually like to work for something bigger than themselves, as you've done with your life.
I would say you find what it is that you're passionate about. As I said earlier, to find an organization that's doing something about it and volunteer with them, feel how it feels. And I think that, if you're working for an effective organization that you can see is making a difference, that's going to, make you feel good about what you're doing and make you want to either stay with that organization or maybe join a national organization that's trying to do that. But always give part of yourself back to society. And if you're starting to do that, like the two of you are at your age, you're going to feel that it feels good. I think that one of the things that's happened with athlete activism, and the reason I think it's never going to stop, is for generations, athletes were used to people asking them, is your injury going to heal? Are you going to play on Saturday night? You think you'll make the playoffs? You think you'll win the championship? Now they're asking them about poverty in America. They're asking about voter suppression. They're asking them about racism, about what they can do. They're being looked at as multidimensional human beings as opposed to just athletes, and it feels good. I can assure you that everybody in your generation, if you do the types of things that I'm suggesting and the types of things I have a real strong feeling you are going to do, it's going to feel good, and you're never going to want to stop it because you're going to feel that you have made a difference and can continue to make a difference.
Yeah, it's definitely, as we've seen in your life since you've continued for so long, it's such a life journey, and it's something that you'll never stop doing, as we've seen in all of your achievements, because of how much of an impact they have. And I personally find it truly incredible that athletes now have these platforms to make change, because people revere them and they see them as such like almost godlike creatures in society, and after all of the achievements they've done. And I think it's amazing that they have these platforms now.
I do too. And I don't know if you saw it, that yesterday, 9 players associations, including all the major women's leagues, signed on to fight as organizations against voter suppression around the United States. It's the first time that all of the players associations of all the different sports came together in unity. And actually, I mean, they've done so individually as players associations, but now they're doing it as all players associations. I remember back in the 1990s, the NBA and its Players Association, the Players Association of the NFL, NBA, and Major League Baseball brought their athletes together in a forum that Spike Lee and I moderated. And we talked about, standing up and going out and that the Players Associations would back them, but they didn't have the momentum at that point to do it. And almost 2 decades went by. But now that it's happened, it's going to be a powerful and positive force for the future. And it's probably the most diverse workplace in the United States in the major sports where Black and Latino players play. And those players are wealthy individuals as well. Because of the income they make, they can invest in social justice programs, as you see so many doing now. It's a different era that I think is going to be a tremendously positive influence.
Yeah, we can definitely see that, especially with like social media, how they can publicize all of it. So many more people are aware of what's going on.
It's encouraging.
Well, Amelia and Claire, a remarkable job as moderators. Thank you. Dr. Lapchick, Richard, we are grateful for your knowledge. We thank you for all of the information you shared, and we for sure believe that this will change. Just since you started talking, Newsday, which is the local paper here, just put out a statement about a high school coach who was caught on a hot mic in Amityville, sharing racial epithets against a football team in Amityville. And it's made the front page of Newsday. And so our work and our advocacy has now been even more amplified by the fact that it's happening in real time here on Long Island. Your guidance will absolutely help us try and educate and inform and inspire people to push against racism at the high school level. And Claire and Amelia, your leadership will be integral to that. And so, Dr. Lapchick, thank you so much for your time. Claire and Amelia, you guys were brilliant. Thank you. And to everybody who joined us tonight, we look forward to seeing you next month on our next Team Up conversation. Be sure to check out longislandnest.com for more information. And thank you so much, Richard, for your time and sharing your knowledge with us. We truly appreciate it.
I'm inspired by the energy I felt in the room.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Amelia. Thanks, Claire. Everybody have a good evening.